Ortis Fanimo just barely dove to the ground to avoid being obliterated by a flying boulder larger than his body. Before he and his fierce ally Mythal knew where it had come from, a second was soaring down from the sky towards them. Instead of dodging, Mythal drew her already large blade and channeled her smoking white God-queller powers to make the weapon even larger. She slashed her blade down and cut the boulder in half, having it soar right past either side of her body. "Whatever this is, I'm going to get to it before you." Ortis leapt up and stared towards the mountains in the direction of the projectiles. Then, with confidence he'd been building over the last 2 weeks, replied, "You might get to it first, but by the time you reach it..." Ortis spotted it, some sort of massive bear, this time raising the corpse of half a horse over its head to throw. He continued, "It'll already be dead." He drew back his bow, Suriastra, aimed up, but before he could release, his hand was smacked upwards by Mythal, and he fired straight into the air. "Whoops, clumsy me." Mythal chuckled as she sprinted towards the bear in a blur of white smoke. At her speed, Ortis only had seconds before she reached their foe, so he couldn't risk shooting an explosive shot and hitting her too. He drew back again and said, "Piercing arrow." The arrow that appeared was blue and narrow. He released, but the bear saw the shot coming. It raised its forearms in front of its heart. When it struck, it made the beast stumble backwards, but the blast didn't break through the yellow armor on its arms. The beast then saw the streak of white smoke headed towards it and hurled the half a horse into Mythal's path. She caught it by the leg, spun it around, and hurled it right back at the bear, hitting it in the head and distracting it while she got even closer. She then swung her extended queller blade at it, but, astoundingly, the bear's armored arms were able to block that as well. Ortis thought he had a shot on the bear's head with it distracted, but he knew he risked hitting Mythal at this great a distance. Even though his weapon couldn't actually kill her, she had been very adamant about him not aiming it at her. He started sprinting towards the mountain, eager to take this monster for himself. 9 monsters had been sent at them in the last 2 weeks, and Mythal had gotten the killing blow on every one of them. Ortis was eager for a win, and was certain he could snatch it this time. After nearly being killed by the Seapoctli sent after them by the leader of the Imperium Pantheon, Tarsa, something had changed in Ortis. He hadn't fully realized it at first, but the following day, when a manticore, a winged lion with a scorpion tail, came after the two of them, he started to see evidence of the change within him. The fear that usually surged through him in life-threatening situations was dramatically minimized, and his entire focus was on evading attacks and finding openings for himself to attack. He'd managed to dodge around the beast's tail a half a dozen times before putting 2 piercing shots through the monster's wings to keep it from flying off, allowing Mythal to get a finishing blow on its head. Over the next 3 attacks from beasts, he noticed that his fear of death had significantly diminished to being almost non-existent. It was as if he'd come so close to death at the jaws of the Seapoctli that it now felt that every day more he had was a gift from fate. This meant he was willing to try much more interesting things in combat, including a little trick he'd finally test out on this day. He was reaching the base of the mountain as Mythal tackled the beast from its perch onto a lower ledge, though still a good 30 feet up from Ortis. The beast landed on its back and Mythal on its stomach. She swung her blade down to cut it in half, but it batted its massive claws at her and struck the weapon from her hand. It landed next to Ortis, though the God-queller extension dissipated. "Nice shot, beast, but pity for you, I can make my own weapons now." Mythal clenched both her fists, and in each appeared white smoke daggers. Using her God-queller abilities to enhance her own weapon had proven to be a better tactic over the last few weeks, but Mythal had also been practicing by making weapons appear out of nothing, solely using her powers, and those had been pretty useful too. Oddly though, while any weapon she used had proven to kill gods in a single fierce enough swipe, much of the time monsters took far more blows to take down. She stabbed both blades into the bear's chest. The roar that followed shook loose boulders from the mountain that rolled down towards Ortis. He grabbed Mythal's blade and moved away, noticing how much lighter her weapon felt from the first time he'd tried to lift it. He had been training with Mythal when they weren't in combat, but he was surprised how much stronger he felt after only 2 weeks. He considered trying to use her weapon in what he was about to do, but decided it could still weigh him down too much. Instead, he set the blade and his backpack down on the other side of a boulder, then climbed up onto it. He drew back Suriastra, saying, "Classic arrow, but 40% power, 25% power." He wasn't even sure that would work, but it felt as though the godly bow confirmed his order telepathically. Ortis took one more look upwards, really hoping this was gonna work. Mythal's arm was in the mouth of the bear and it was slamming her against the wall of the mountain repeatedly. He knew she'd be fine, but figured he should still help, and he really wanted the final shot for himself. He knew the gauntlet Ares had given him prevented the flames of Suriastra from hurting him, but this impact could still be too much for his body to handle. Okay, here goes something. He leapt off the boulder and shot right below himself. The arrow struck the ground below him and an explosion of flame sent him soaring upwards, spinning through the air. He shot right past Mythal and the bear, with both pausing curiously to watch Ortis spiral, well above their heads. Even 25% had been too much. But still, the extra distance gave Ortis time to get his bearings in midair, spin his body around, and draw back his bow again, pointing it downwards as his ascent slowed. As his rise finally stopped, there was a perfect moment of stillness before he began falling. And in that moment, he called out, "Piercing shot!" He released, and the arrow burst down from the sky like a meteor. It struck straight through the bear's shoulder and made it bellow out in pain, releasing Mythal. The arm attached to that shoulder now hung limp. So, Mythal grabbed the beast's own claw and leapt upwards as quickly as she could, driving the 3 massive nails right up through its lower jaw into its head. A low growl rumbled out of the beast, but it slowly fell back and tumbled off the mountain. But as it was doing that, Ortis was falling towards the ground himself, realizing the significant flaw in his plan. Mythal, we can call this your win if you catch me." She jumped into the air and grabbed Ortis right out of the sky, falling with him in her arms down to the ground, near where the bear had just fallen dead. They landed and Mythal set her ally down. "Well, I do believe this win would be mine either way, as I did land the fatal shot, but I appreciate the acknowledgement, I suppose." "Oh yeah, 'cause you had that handled without me, right? Next time should I let the monster slam you into the wall another dozen times or so before I save you?" Mythal chuckled, clearly impressed by Ortis's retort, giving him a look that he hadn't gotten from women many times before. A look he didn't really know how to interpret. The closest comparison he could come up with was she was looking at him as if he was food, but in a good way. She wrapped an arm around his shoulder and pulled him towards the monster. "Well, I'd actually quite graciously be willing to call this a draw if you pull out that little book Ares gave you and tell me what it is we've just slayed." Ortis felt himself blushing with Mythal's arm around him, which seemed odd as she'd carried him and caught him many times before that. Still, he ignored it and said, "Well, I could, but seeing as how we just defeated a monster, odds are he's gonna show up eating or drinking some assorted foods in 3, 2...
Actually, kid, I've been here watching for most of that little scrap. That was a risky move you tried. I like it."
They both walked around to the other side of the bear's body to see the Greek god of war leaned up against its corpse, eating some sort of pastry off a golden tray.
"And I'm not the only predictable one, you know. We all know that girly here is gonna attack me in the next 5 seconds.
Mythal lifted off of Ortis and crossed her arms in front of her. "Perhaps I won't this time, if you willingly give me whatever it is you're voraciously devouring." "What is that?" He swallowed one, then lifted another, smelling it.
"I don't even know. Stole it from the festivity preparations back in Olympia. Some kind of puff pastry with spinach in it. Surprisingly delicious. You could both have one, I guess."
Ortis gratefully took one, and Mythal defiantly snatched 3. Ortis took a bite, and it was, in fact, incredible. It made sense that it would be tasty. Anything made for the kickoff of the Olympiad needed to be of the highest quality. The main events of the Olympic Games would draw people from all across Greece and even farther than that. The celebration had been started by Heracles ages ago as a sporting competition to honor his father, Zeus, and since then it had become a beloved tradition, even by many of those who did not feel so kindly towards Zeus. Ortis swallowed a bite of his next pastry, then asked, "So, do you know what that monster was, and which god sent it this time?"
"Well, I don't know every monster just by looking at it, kid. But I'm pretty sure I've seen this one before at the Beast Farm. So the Imperium Pantheon is probably getting impatient and sending stuff from there to get you."
Mythal chomped down her third treat and asked, "Beast Farm? What is that?" Ares tilted his head at her.
"I mean, come on, you can't tell from the name. Seems pretty intuitively obvious to me. Back me up on this, kid."
Ortis then replied, "Well, from context, I'd assume it's some kind of farm where the gods keep and breed monsters."
"This is why he's my favorite of you two. It's run by a goddess named Amphanella. She's the daughter of Typhon and Angrboda. Don't know when that happened since Typhon has been locked up for as long as I can remember. But he had a kid with the Norse goddess of monsters at some point. He's been running that place since before the Imperium Pantheon even started. Takes in lots of monsters that different pantheons made and forgot about over the years. But the Pantheon has been using it and grabbing a lot of its fiercest beasties out of there to do things like raid nations, kill rogue demigods, and attack you two, I guess."
Replying in a surprisingly reserved manner, Mythal asked, "Interesting, and where might one find this beast farm?"
It's on the coast of Vingelmark in the North Pantheon territory, but don't get any ideas of going there yourself anytime soon. Still takes two of you to take out one monster. You're not going to do so good against hundreds of them. Plus, the gods may not have an exact beat on your location, but they're tracking you well enough to know if you make a move for a place like that. Do that, and I wouldn't be surprised if they pass on monsters and send one of the bigs like Zeus or Izanami or someone after you, and just wrap this whole thing up quick. But anyway,
he said, stepping away from the bear and looking it up and down.
You two gonna do something with this, or can I take it and see if it'll cook up nice?
Ortis expected Mythal to say no just to spite Ares, but instead replied, "Have at it, God of War, and the next time you decide to swing by for a post-monster snack, make sure to bring more provisions to share, would you? I'm still quite hungry." He winked, put his hand on the bear, and a swirl of black smoke enveloped him and the beast, and they vanished. Immediately, Mythal grabbed Ortis by the shoulders and lifted him up. "Did you hear that? There is a place where we can slay hundreds of monsters at once. That will really drive a nail in the god's nerves." Ortis's eyes widened, feeling some of his old fearful self slipping back in. I'm all for taking on some tougher foes, but like Ares said, hundreds at once is definitely out of our current skill level." Mythal grinned menacingly. But you have a little secret weapon, Ortis, that I bet Ares doesn't know about. A quite devastating one that you've yet to try." Ortis instantly knew what she meant, glancing down at Suriastra. "I don't know, Mythal. Even just drawing back the Devastator arrow feels like I'm courting a demon by summoning those flames." "Exactly, Ortis. It's likely far more lethal than anything you fired from that bow before. We get a distant vantage point, you fire it, and it could wipe that entire farm off the face of the earth in one shot. Or at least kill a few dozen of the monsters there, then we can flee. Either way, that would significantly set your monster kill count far ahead of my own." As she said that, she once again gave him that look that he was unfamiliar with, but it made his heart pound. She was right, this could be a huge victory for them while also being a huge hindrance to the gods. The gods can make more monsters, but it does take time, even with Tarsa's Beast Sphere. Plus, above everything else, this seemed like it would really impress Mythal if it worked out. Against his better judgment, Ortis grinned. "Well, what are we waiting for then? Let's go devastate some monsters." She wrapped her arms around him and spun him around eagerly. You become more fun every day." She set him down and their eyes locked for a moment. They then quickly looked away from each other and Ortis said, "Thanks. I'll go grab the bag and your blade." Ortis grabbed their supplies and quickly opened the book Ares had swiped for them from Echidna and found that the monster they'd just slain was another of Izanami's creations, called the Onikuma. Izanami was the Shinto goddess of death who was keeping any gods that acted out against the Imperium Pantheon as prisoners in her underworld. After Izanami crossed his mind, Ortis said to Mythal, "I wonder if the other gods trapped by Izanami would be willing to help us take down the Pantheon. Maybe if we found a way to free them from her underworld, they could be like our own god army." Mythal rolled her eyes. "We don't free trapped gods, Ortis. We kill gods. They just end up betraying us anyway." Ortis felt pretty strongly that she was jumping to conclusions, but was scared to make her angry, so he just let it go. Ortis put their supplies on his back, then hopped onto Mythal's back as she sprinted them off at her super speeds to start a multi-day journey towards Vingelmark. Ortis expected Ares to come find them at some point and discourage them from their obvious heading, but he never appeared. One evening, when they'd stopped for Ortis to get some sleep, he lay back on the ground looking up at the stars and asked, "Hey, Mythal, what do you think you'll do when we've beaten them? When the Imperium Pantheon is dead, I mean. Are you gonna go back home?" Certainly not. Nothing much for me there. I suppose I'll continue hunting gods and monsters. It is quite fun, and it does seem to be what I was born to do. Besides, it's not as if Lorna will miss me as long as she has a good book to read, and I doubt either of my parents are ever planning to come back. What about you?" "Well, I would kind of like to move back to New Athens. It's a beautiful city with so many interesting and creative people. I just couldn't stand how divided it became. Everyone was so guarded, and if you didn't agree with someone about what gods were the truest gods, then you risked them freaking out at you or calling you a bad person or just not talking to you anymore. I'm hoping with the Pantheon gone and a lot of other gods gone, people will see that we don't need gods, and it didn't matter which one you worshipped in the first place, as long as whatever lessons you took from them encouraged you to be good to the people around you. He rolled his head to look over at Mythal. But honestly, I think I'll just be tempted to keep helping you with whatever you decide to do, if you'd be happy to keep me along. His heart was thumping so hard as he said that he worried she could see it pulsing through his shirt. He expected some kind of witty response, but instead, Mythal got surprisingly quiet and just said, "I'd like that, Ortis. It would be nice to have someone I care about who doesn't abandon me." Ortis wanted to ask what she meant, but she then quickly said, "Now get some sleep, we'll likely reach the beast farm tomorrow, and we need you at your full potential. Who knows how much strength it will take for you to fire that Devastator arrow." She was right, though if he was honest, he'd rather just stay up all night talking to Mythal than prepare for the next day's events. But he knew Mythal was excited about this plan, so he closed his eyes and nodded off. The next day they reached Vinglemark, but had a harder time than expected finding the farm. As the evening came, Mythal was frustrated that they hadn't found anything. They considered stopping their search for the day, when suddenly something swooped down from the sky and tried to pluck Ortis off of Mythal's back. Ortis felt something tugging his bag and raising him into the air, so he grabbed Suriastra and swung it behind him, smacking whatever creature it was in the head. It shrieked and retreated back into the sky. Mythal skidded to a halt and Ortis leapt off her. They looked up and saw 4 similarly unpleasant creatures in the sky. They were like vampiric women with tattered wings, but they were all missing their lower halves. Ortis was about to draw back his bow when something caught his eye through a break in the trees. He jogged over to it to look down a large hill. Mythal drew her blade. "I would have thought you'd be eager to strike these beasts from the sky before I got a shot at them, but by all means go on a little stroll and leave them to me." One of the creatures swooped down at Mythal, shrieking and baring its fangs. She darted aside and swiped her blade up, slicing the creature's head off and making it crash to the ground. "Odd, these beasts seem surprisingly weak compared to what we've faced. The gods may already be losing their touch." Ortis turned back to Mythal. "These weren't sent by the gods. I think they're just protecting their home. Look!" Mythal darted over next to him and looked beyond the forest they were in. There was a huge field with dozens of massive barns and stables. There were even several small lakes where Ortis could see creatures skimming their fins along the surface. Beasts like hydras wandered around in fenced-in ranges. And they both realized they had found it. The beast farm. Ortis was suddenly worried that whatever the Devastator arrow did, it wouldn't be nearly enough to take out a place this massive. But before they could worry about that, they had to finish off these pesky batwomen. Another was telegraphing its attack, crying out as it flew towards them, and Ortis spun around, drew back a piercing arrow, and fired it right through the monster's chest. It flopped through the air towards them, and Mythal batted it aside, then burst into the air towards another. It flew out of her path, but Mythal clenched her free fist and manifested a smoking dagger. She hurled it at the beast and struck it in the shoulder of its wing. It spun through the air and crashed into a tree before falling to the ground. It started crawling along the ground towards Ortis, so he fired a piercing shot right through its head. He then looked over to see Mythal had snatched the last one out of the sky and tackled it right into the ground, pinning it down with her knee before driving her blade through its back. She pulled her blade back out and came over to Ortis. "Well, the time is now, Ortis. Let's see how devastating that arrow truly is." He looked down at the farm, finding the place he considered to be the middle, hoping the impact would radiate out enough to kill at least a large percent of the monsters. Ortis took a deep breath and started drawing back Suriastra as he said, "Devastator Flame." A massive flaming black arrow appeared. Ortis's body was trembling as he pulled it. It felt like there were demons whispering in his ears and crawling under his skin. The veins on his arms started turning black. He didn't want to hold this thing any longer, so he aimed. But just before releasing, a voice said, "What are you doing? And who are you?" Ortis held the bow as steady as he could, but glanced to the side to see a thin blonde woman with a fur pelt over her shoulders walking towards them and staring in angry confusion. He then noticed the glowing runes on her arms. She must be Amphanella, the goddess daughter of Typhon and Angrboda. Mythal stepped past Ortis towards her. "Ah, another god to quell. This is turning out to be a very productive day." Ortis wasn't getting much of a threatening vibe from this goddess, but before he could say anything to Mythal, his strength gave out, and he released his shot. A shockwave of black mist burst around them as the arrow loosed, and Ortis felt like the air had been briefly sucked from his lungs. They all then watched as the flaming black shot soared across the skies towards the center of the farm. For a moment, Ortis was starting to think it may hit and do little more than a regular Suriastra shot. It didn't fly differently from the others, but when it struck ground, there was a pulse through the earth, followed by a brief moment of stillness. Then, a massive plume of black and orange flames ignited the farm, and fire exploded across it. They all watched as the shockwave rolled through the farm, eviscerating the barns and engulfing every single monster. Soon, all of the fields had disappeared into flames and smoke, but the shockwave continued. It rolled up over the hill right towards Ortis. He closed his eyes and was hurled off his feet. A sound like an evil cackling filled his ears before he was slammed into a tree and dropped to the ground. He kept his eyes closed, feeling the heat of the flames around him, but thankfully being protected from them by his enchanted gauntlet. When the heat finally lessened and the wind of the shockwave faded, Ortis opened his eyes and stood up. The trees around him were all either fallen or bent sideways and burning. He climbed over fallen trunks to get back to where he'd fired and saw a massive mushroom cloud in the middle of the farm, and the few monsters still living were scrambling around trying to roll flames off of them. Even the lakes had been completely evaporated and the monsters in them were either dead or flailing in flames. Even if it technically had been more successful than Ortis had thought, it was still a horrifying sight. He looked at his arm and saw that, while his hand now felt fine despite being a bit shaken, his fingers had turned black and dark veins crawled up his arm still. He had a foul feeling churning in his gut, and it only got worse when he heard the horrified cry from Amphanella.
Fenrir! Fenrir, no, please, run to me!
Amphanella sprinted down the hill towards a stumbling, flaming, massive wolf that collapsed to the ground before it reached her. She ran to its side and tried patting out the flames searing away its fur.
Fenrir, please, roll over. I can't put them all out myself. Fenrir!
She suddenly saw that the wolf was no longer moving, not even breathing. She ran over to its head and dropped down next to him.
No, Fenrir, you're okay. You're going... Please, wake up!
If that was the Fenrir that Ortis had heard of, then the foul flames of the Devastator arrow had just killed a beast that was fabled to one day devour the sun. Ortis slowly walked down the burning hill towards Amphanella as she cried out across the scorched fields.
Medusa! Abaya, please, anyone be okay?
Ortis felt like there were stones in his stomach. He'd never thought about whether someone actually cared about any of the monsters they may kill here, but they were still dangerous. Hadn't this still been the right thing to do? While Ortis was lost in the despair of his thoughts, he suddenly noticed that Mythal was marching up behind the grieving goddess. "Don't worry about your little pet. You'll be joining them momentarily." Amphanella turned to see Mythal approaching, but was too shaken to get up. Ortis ran over. Mythal, wait, we can't just kill this thoughtlessly. Maybe this was a mistake." Mythal just chuckled. "Oh, Ortis, so easily swayed by a few tears. Understandable, but if we're going to slay all the gods, you're going to have to strengthen your resolve." She continued closer to Amphanella, but Ortis stepped in front of her. "No, I'm serious, Mythal. She's not even on the Imperium Pantheon. We've done what we came here to do, and we've clearly done enough to her already." Mythal picked up Ortis, dashed to the side, set him down, then dashed back over, right next to Amphanella, with her sword raised. Ortis didn't have time to run back, so instinctively, he raised his weapon, said, "Piercing arrow," then fired it at Mythal's blade. It struck the sword right out of her hand. He then started walking towards her. "Mythal, we really have to think about this. Why are you looking at me like that?" His march slowed as he saw that she was slowly turning to him with rage in her eyes. "What was the one rule I gave you when I took that weapon for you, Ortis?" She was now ignoring Amphanella and stomping towards him with her fists clenched. He started backing away. I didn't want to aim it at you. You just weren't listening to me." "I should have known you'd turn on me eventually. I never should have trusted anyone again." White smoke was swirling around her hands, and in his fear, Ortis thought she was making daggers. Was she really angry enough at him to kill him? All this time, had she really been like all those closed-minded people back in New Athens? Someone who would strike someone down just for speaking a different opinion? Ortis put his hand to Suriastra's string and was about to pull it back. If she was just another of those bitter, angry people, then at least he'd go down fighting. But he stopped himself from drawing back the string. Ortis stared at Mythal's furious face as she got closer. She looked bloodthirsty, but he knew he'd gotten other looks from those eyes before, ones not so fueled by instinctive rage. And behind it, under all that rage, he felt he could see the faintest glimmer of something very familiar to himself. Fear. And he was pretty sure he now understood what that fear was of. Ortis stopped backing away, looked at Suriastra, then hurled it to the ground. Mythal, I swear I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know everyone else in your life has so far. Your parents leaving out of nowhere, Lorna not acting like she cared even when a god showed up to try and kill you at your home. But I promise you I do care. I'm sorry I shot at you. I shouldn't have done that, but it wasn't me turning on you, I promise. I understand why you jumped to the idea that I was betraying you, because you've probably felt betrayed by everyone else you've ever cared about. I mean, I almost just jumped to my own conclusion about you just now because of my own trust issues with people, so I get how that's so easy to do. But I don't want us to break what's here over a small, nothing problem like this. I care about you too much. I feel like I wasn't even living before I met you. Mythal slowed her approach. Her furious expression started twitching into sadness. I will fight with you until wherever this road ends, even if that means my own death. But if we're going to be partners on this, I need to be able to disagree with you, and you have to be willing to listen. I was a god slave to the Pantheon and was terrified that they'd kill me if I ever spoke out against them. I can't just become the same thing for you. Mythal's wavering anger completely vanished into grief, and she stepped back. I'm not trying to make you my slave, Ortis. He walked towards her. I know that. It's okay. I think we've both just had people be so terrible to us before, so it's going to take time for us to get used to the fact that we don't have to expect the same thing from each other. You don't have to be afraid that I'm going to betray you or abandon you, because I would never do that. Ortis stopped right in front of Mythal. A tear was rolling down her face, and she didn't meet Ortis's gaze. This was the first time he was seeing her not as some mighty god-slaying warrior, but instead just as a girl who had been hurt before and didn't want to be hurt again. She wiped the tear away. You promise you're not going to abandon me? Then, surprising even himself, Ortis stood up on his toes, grabbed the back of Mythal's head, and kissed her. She leaned into it and almost accidentally pushed Ortis over. When he pulled his head back, he said, I promise I'm not going to abandon you. Mythal seemed as though she were going to kiss him again, when a voice bellowed through the smoke. What a touching final moment for you two. They both looked over and through a plume of smoke saw the glow of godly runes approaching. Far more runes than Ortis had ever seen on one being. It had to be another god, maybe even one from the Imperium Pantheon like Ares said may come for them if they attack the farm. Ortis darted over to Suriastra on the ground, knelt, and raised it, aimed at the god. The voice sounded female, and he feared it may be Izanami. But when the figure stepped from the smoke, he suddenly wished it were her. Final licks of black smoke slid off the goddess as the Imperium Pantheon's leader, Tarsa, stepped into view. Piercing arrow, Ortis said as he released his shot, but Tarsa didn't even bother moving. The arrow struck her head and barely bumped it backwards. She glanced over to him. Cute. She thrust her fist in his direction as if punching him. Despite being a ways away, the wind from her thrust shot at Ortis and struck him like a charging bull, sending him flopping backwards, rolling across the ground. Ortis! I will end you for that! Mythal cried as she leapt towards Tarsa. Before Mythal even reached her though, Tarsa sprang into the air to meet her so fast, she may as well have teleported. She snatched Mythal by the neck, then, while hovering in the air, she hurled Mythal straight into the ground, making a crater in the earth. She then dropped down and slammed her heel into Mythal's back, making her scream out in pain. Ortis raised his bow again and saw that, behind Tarsa, making things even worse, Amphanella was transforming. Her body was pulsing with green light and growing into a green giantess beast. He couldn't worry about her yet, though. He fired another piercing shot and another, trying to hit any part of Tarsa that may be a weakness, but nothing worked. She ignored every strike and pounded her fist into Mythal's head, then raised her off the ground by her hair. You don't seem to be conscious anymore, but if you are, wave goodbye to your mortal pet. He can't visit you where you're going. Tarsa then started dragging Mythal's limp body back into the smoke. Ortis stopped firing and just sprinted at her. Let her go! Tarsa didn't even look his way as she just thrust her fist at him again. Once more, a wave of wind sent him flying backwards. He sprang up quickly as Tarsa was just pulling Mythal into the smoke. He ran at her again. Mythal, I'm coming! Please, wake up! Fight back! Do something! Mythal was barely able to raise her head and keep her eyes open as she vanished into the smog. Ortis tried to run in after her. He couldn't see anything, but he kept running and called out, to no avail. Mythal, I promise, I'll find you. I will find you, Mythal. He kept running in circles until he came back out of the smoke, right where he'd entered. He then just collapsed to his knees, right near a towering green giantess.
Is she gone?
Amphanella said in her altered form. Ortis gripped his weapon tight, knowing that if he wanted to find Mythal, he had to survive this encounter first. He nodded in response to her question. The giantess then replied,
Good.
No matter what happened next, Ortis swore he would survive it and keep his promise. He would find Mythal. Kronk tilted his... Kronk. Not Kronk.
I mean, come on. This has got to be the character that I do the weirdest faces for when I'm voicing him. I don't know why, but this really helps. I don't even think I could do his voice with a normal face. I don't even think I could do it.
Yes, I can, but...
Feels better. It just, feels better to go like this. For some reason, that kind of helps.
Well, that story went longer than I thought it would, and I didn't even get to the cliffhanger that I wanted to end on. We ended on an earlier cliffhanger, but we'll get to that other cliffhanger eventually, though it probably won't be a cliffhanger when we get to it. Whatever. Anyway, if you're enjoying this series and you haven't seen the earlier episodes, you might want to go back to those, or maybe check out the first episode of The Summoner's Beasts, which is a story that's, I guess tone-wise is going to be a little bit similar to this one, so maybe I shouldn't have been doing these two at the same time, but whatever, I started them both, so I'm going to do them. I want to get a horror story into this mix of recurring series at some point in the near future too. But if I get too many series going at once, then I'm going to be, stacking too much on each other and it's going to be too long between episodes. So I'm going to try to not start a new series before I finish one of the existing ones, either Season 1 of Vigilance or Mythal Lethal. Speaking of which, we're going to have 2 back-to-back episodes of Vigilance, one on Sunday and one on Monday, and I'm very excited for both of those, but besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which is that those who commit to nothing are distracted by everything. And what that makes me think of is, as a creative person, like most of you listening probably are, there's a good chance you have a ton of different projects that you want to try doing, whether it's write a comic, write a book, create a YouTube channel, make an art book. And that's how I was when I was starting PopCross Studios. I had a ton of different things I wanted to try. But the reason I ended up succeeding with PopCross Studios was because I picked one thing and committed to that. And now we're here and I can do more experimenting with those other kinds of projects I wanted to try. Like how Vigilance and Mythal Lethal are both going to be turned into books when the seasons are finished. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all and I'll see you all in the next episode on Sunday. Goodbye.